Hello, ladies and gents. Justin Johnson. We're on the module A328. How do empires begin? But first of all, let's reflect on us, me, you, all of our surroundings. Have you done enough for your virtue? Do you feel like you've done more? Do you feel like you've done more in part of the community, or putting effort into life than the next person? Do you work hard for your weekend? Do you do something methodical day in, day out that makes you feel like, do you know what? I'm doing enough. I am doing enough. I'm putting my effort in within society as best as my ability. We're all trying to broaden and rise, and we're all trying to go to reach our destination. Some of us are mentally ill, or physically ill, or terminally ill. Some of us just try and get on with limited capacity that we have. We keep striving on to be a better person than we was yesterday. Well, anyway, I'm not pointing fingers. So no one jump to conclusions. So whatever it is you do, then you do it well. As long as you work hard at it, that's all that matters in life. No one can judge you. No one in this entire world can judge you apart from the man above. How do empires begin? Also, make sure, have a little look on the pole next to me. Do you do enough throughout your week to make you earn your weekend? So when you go gallivanting around your local pubs with friends or having social circles, that because you've worked hard on a building site or you've worked hard in something, does that give you the right? Does that give you the working right to go and sit down a pub and slander other people's names? Does that give you the right? What gives you the right? Being a bully, subjugating on somebody. What gives anyone the right? Talk about human rights. Do they have the rights? How do empires begin? Now, there's a thought. Page 130. Atlantic systems and the beginnings of empire. The Spanish had their sights on the Atlantic islands too, from 1402 to the end of the 1490s. Successive Spanish colonizers battled the Guanche peoples for control of the Canary Islands. To the south of Madeira, Spain's approach was one that will become familiar to you from your study of other imperial powers. It makes alliances with a local ruler and then uses these alliances to establish settlement on the island. Once in situ, they could use this alliance to leverage local and regional power, often through exploiting local rivalries, in order to seize land through military conquest. After conquest, the Spanish crown contracted land out to European settlers, either through leases, mortgages, or sharecropping arrangements. On Gran Canaria, the Spanish crown gave the first colonists land grants that would last 6 years. During this time, settlers would need to construct a house, live in that house within 5 years, and single men were expected to marry. This gives you a good sense of what the objective was: to establish permanent and profitable settlement communities on the islands. Settlement was international: Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, Genoese, and Vietnamese settlers are lived or traded on the Canaries, lured by their proximity to the markets of the West African mainland, linking them to the lucrative Atlantic trading network. The focus on profit meant that Canarian agriculture quickly became a monoculture, where sugarcane was the main crop on what we might call plantations. When soil exhaustion became a problem in Madeira, Portuguese sugarcane producers looked to extend production into Canaries. On Gran Canaria, sugar was a truly international product. Agriculture knowledge come from the Moroccans, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. The irrigation methods were imported from Madeira, using technology development developed in Muslim North America. Processing was in the modern sugar mills, developed with Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and Chinese technology. Grinding the sugarcane with water-powered cylinders. Alberto Vieira has estimated that in 1520, the 38 sugar mills in Gran Canaria produced over 2 million kilos of sugar. All of it for export. The sugar industry produced a whole new social order on the sugar islands. This included landowners, some of whom were resident while the others were absent. Mill masters, foreign merchants whose activities were often highly regulated, resident merchants who usually had more rights to hold government contracts for import and export, indentured servants who were mostly European, an increasingly large population of enslaved Africans who were invariably purchased through the island of Cabo Verde of Samoa. Page 132. The plantation culture that developed in the Portuguese and Spanish Atlantic sugar islands incubated chattel slavery based on trade slave model, which is imported from West Africa. The Portuguese took the model of enslaved Africans on the sugar plantations of Sao Tome and Madeira and transported across the Atlantic to Brazil. The Spanish took their model of enslavement to Cuba and it spread through the Caribbean, including to the English colony of Barbados. English planters would in turn bring sugar plantation to the colony of South Carolina. 7 of the governors of South Carolina had backgrounds connected to Barbados. Both sweet and deadly, capital and commodity, sugar has long played an important role in the early Atlantic imaginary. The story of the Atlantic world, sugar production has traditionally and necessarily been told in terms of its rising influence on market capitalism and metropolitan tastes. As plant and product, sugar was the foundational ingredient of the Atlantic world appetite, a raw material for alcohol production, and the basis of dessert and tea rituals. It realigned aesthetic values, changed cultural appetites, shaped commodity relations, and become part of the transnational culinary commodity identity formations. Organisers of Beyond Sweetness, new histories of sugar in the early Atlantic world, asked participants to think beyond the traditional narrative of the sugar revolution to consider these far-reaching cultural, political, economic, and personal resonances of the sugarcane plant. In particular, this would include recognition of sugar production dependence on the transatlantic slave trade, making visible a violent history as well as a bitter sweet legacy. The first detailed discussion of sugar, slavery, and capitalism was published in 1994 by the historian Eric Williams. In his Capitalism and Slavery, Williams argued that the roots of the Industrial Revolution in Britain lay in the commodity production of slave-based economies of the Caribbean. Since then, historians have debated Williams' arguments. In this section, we're going to get insight into the nature of his historiographical debate by looking at a short excerpt from an influential article by B.W. Hyman about the sugar revolution. What are the 6 elements of sugar revolution and why is it useful? To isolate these 6 central elements, how do you think Hyman decides on the central elements? What made the sugar revolution revolutionary? Of many revolutions identified by historians, only one takes its name from a particular commodity. This is the sugar revolution. Concatenation of events located in the 17th century Caribbean with far-reaching ramifications for the Atlantic world. Unlike the more broadly based revolutions typical of economic history, the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, the Commercial Revolution, the Price Revolution, the Sugar Revolution points to the transformative power of a single commodity, resulting in what has sometimes been termed crop determinism. Determined influence have readily been attributed to other crops, rice, wheat, potatoes, for example, but none of these have given their names to the transformations with which they are associated. Sugar alone has achieved that status. The six central elements of the sugar revolution are commonly regarded as swift from diversified agriculture to sugar monoculture, from production on small farms to large plantations, from free to slave labour, from sparse to dense settlement, from white to black populations, and from how to high value per capita output. More broadly, it is claimed that the sugar revolution has five effects. It generated a massive boost to the Atlantic slave trade, provided the engine for a variety of triangular trades, altered European nutrition and consumption, and increased European interest in tropical colonies, and more contentiously contributed vitally to the Industrial Revolution. Not all accounts of the sugar revolution include each of these features. Like most of the revolutions of economic history, the sugar revolution concept has developed and diffused, tending to take on new elements and expanding claims made for its significance. These claims have entered the mainstream of long run global economic history and development economics. In the most complete long term study, the rise and fall plantation complex, tracing the diffusion from the Mediterranean to the Americas, Curtin concluded that the 17th century sugar revolution was indeed a revolution, though that particularly sugar revolution of the 17th century was only one among many. Thus, for Curtin, the movement of the complex. From Madeira to Brazil was a sugar revolution, as there was each of the subsequent movements within the Caribbean as beyond to Mauritius, Natal, Fiji, and Hawaii. At the same time, Curtin gave a special place to the sugar revolution of the Eastern Caribbean, arguing that it followed the institutional and economic patterns established in Brazil. This new version of plantation complex was more specialized, more dependent on networks of maritime, intercontinental communication. Barbados retains its place as an archetype of sugar revolution and has been the focus of the most sophisticated technical studies. Most of this work has been concerned with the transition from white indentured to black enslaved labour. Economic and counterfactual modelling has been applied for the labour question in several studies, many of them comparing the experience of the sugar colonies with that of the tobacco colonies, the mainland. An uneasy consensus emerged that the sugar planters' shift to slave labour was a product of rational market choice. What is most important for present purpose is that these analyses are explicitly set in the content of the sugar revolution while rejecting the deterministic and racial interpretations of the earlier scholars. However, climate and race have proven hard to shake off, resurfacing as perceptions and attitudes or as active biological agents. Has argued the importance of non-economic factors in the choice of enslaved Africans over indentured whites, a choice ensured by the fact that the sugar revolution proceeded too quickly to allow Europeans to adjust perceptions of insiders and outsiders. Higman wrote this historiographical essay at the time when the subdiscipline of Atlantic history was becoming popular in the early 2000s, and historians were searching for useful ways to categorize and explain systems of labor, economics, and people's experience around the Atlantic. One way to analyze the Atlantic past is through the lens of sugar. Question whether sugar production created a revolution in economic, social, and political realities. Himond's archetype considers the archetype of Barbados the typical example which most closely fits the theoretical six central elements outlined at the start. We will turn in more detail to spread of sugar cultivation in Barbados and the social and economic impact it had on the development of the British Atlantic. Page 138. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh attempted to establish a settlement community in Roanoke, Virginia. This early attempt in colonization failed, but it marked the start and finish. The British imperial expansion westwards from the early 1600s through to the American Revolution. The English, then British settlements, colonies in North America would become a cornerstone of the British Empire. Early organisation of the empire propaganda. It is easy to think that English colonisation of the eastern seaboard of the North American continent was planned out affair. In reality, English settlement was sporadic and chaotic, and somewhat of a gamble. As with Barbados, empire began in the interest of opportunist privateers and adventurers like Sir Walter Raleigh. Competing joint stock companies, all ill-placed communities of religious dissenters who sought sanctuary thousands of miles from home in a hostile and unfamiliar land they hoped their God would help them to tame. Early success was scarce. The first voyages were financed by a pro-expansion group of courtiers and landed gentry in England, often with the promise of monopoly of natural resources or trade commodities that were discovered. For all the expense, failure was very common. However, at the time when the English state was becoming more centralised under the late Tudor and early smart monarchs, colonial competition acquired a naturalistic hue. Through the writings of men like Richard Hakluyt, 1553 to 1616, stories of overseas exploration were quickly conflated with a national narrative, risk-taking and entrepreneurial, staunchly Protestant, and deeply hostile in Spain and France. Public support was essential to make imperial settlement work if people were to invest large amounts of money or uproot their lives to risk settlement. Thousands of miles away, they would need information about the so-called New World. This information would need to create enthusiasm about the adventure and possibilities of empire. The two most significant propagandists were John White and Theodore de Bry, whose paintings and engravings captured the 17th century English imagination. White's painting derived from a relatively short stay in North America, 1858, part of the Sir Walter Raleigh's expedition parties. In 1590, the Flemish publisher Theodore de Bry used White's paintings as the basis of a series of engravings. Their representation of indigenous Americans helped to create enduring myths of the other, which would fill the fear of exoticization of the exciting inhabitants of the land that Englishmen would colonize. How does de Bry portray Algonquin society? Is de Bry's portrayal of the Algonquins a sympathetic one? What features of the image inform your conclusion? Any kind of overseas travel and exploration carried massive risk. Effective propaganda and the success of the Spanish and Dutch convinced more English merchants and traders that investment in exploration was worth the financial risk. However, the early modern English state did not have enough finance to sponsor overseas colonisation. This meant the finance for colonial expansion had to come to private groups and individuals. Merchant guilds did not have the right kind of organisation to raise the vast amounts of money necessary for this. A different kind of financial arrangement was necessary. Joint stock companies provided a solution. Shareholders would invest money and then receive dividends as a percentage of profits generated through colonial land acquisition of trade in high-value commodities like gold and later human captives. Although separate from the state, joint stock companies were usually granted monopoly rights by the Crown for specific types of overseas trade. Although not all companies operated in the same way, their shared objective was to harness the wealth of a large group of people and limit their financial liability in the event of disaster. By the 1670s, insurers like Lloyd's of London were beginning to offer insurance to mitigate the risk shipping across the Atlantic, and especially against the loss of property, including enslaved people. Thus, the early phase of English colonialism were characterized by these often complicated public-private partnerships. The earliest was a Muscovy Company, chartered in 1555 to operate a monopoly of trade around the Middle East. What does this tell you about the main components of Empire British North America? Look at the maps. You can match the companies and geographic areas in English British colonisation. You'll see which company was responsible for directing colonial settlement on the eastern seaboard to North America. There's no discussion in this through the end. This will help you work through the content and table and connect this new knowledge with what we already know. Virginia Company of London, also known as London Company, 1606. Inject capital investment into English colonisation in North America, especially after the failure of Wakanake Colony in 1580s. Modelled closely on the East India Company chartered in 1600, investors were chiefly based in London and Plymouth. London investors were designated the area around the Chesapeake Bay for colonisation difficulties in attracting and organising settlers, and Labour led to the recall of charter in 1624, and Virginia became a royal colony. Virginia Company of Plymouth, 1606, to settle land in North America around the present-day Maine. They were largely unsuccessful, but laid the foundations for Plymouth Colony, settled by rivals of Mayflower in 1620 and the Massachusetts Bay Company, Newfoundland Company, 1610. To control English settlement of Avalon Peninsula, Newfoundland, there saw potential of massive profits from local codfish to export to markets in Spain. They did not receive monopoly on fishing, but believed that colonial settlement would bring about de facto monopoly of the trade. Massachusetts Bay Company, 1629. To trade in fish and furs around New England under John Winthrop, 1587-1649, the company provided the foundation and governance of the religious Commonwealth for Puritan settlers of the colony Massachusetts. It became the most successful English chartered company in the 17th century North America, and the first whose board of governors resided in the colony. The charter revoked in 1686 when Massachusetts Bay became part of the Dominion of New England. Hudson's Bay Company, 1670. To control English fur trade and settlement primarily in Rupert's Land, present-day Canada, and protect against French competition. It was the most financial lucrative joint stock company in North America. With a trade monopoly over the most of Canada, it surrendered its charter to the Crown in 1869 as part of Canadian Confederation. The modern iteration of the company has significant retail presence in North America. Royal African Company, the RAC, 1672. To trade in enslaved people from West Africa to Americas. RAC shipped sailed from Bristol, London, and Liverpool, and shipped over 5,000 enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and Virginia from 1680 to 86. The RAC lost its monopoly in 1698, but continued in the slave trade until 1731, its successor. The regulated company of merchants trading to Africa operated in the slave trade until it was abolished in 1821 and its property taken over by the Crown. Colonial different in the British North America was regional. There were distinct differences in culture, religion, government, agriculture, industry, climate, and relationships with indigenous neighbours across all the colonial settlements. New England, Chesapeake or Middle colonies, and Southern colonies. We'll leave that there. Thanks for listening.